Sadly for most GPs, our education is all about insulin initiation and intensification to overcome, GP inertia. We're bad GPs if we're not intensifying the dose and, starting people on insulin. And this was sent to me in an email not long ago for GP education, sponsored by a drug company. And so there's nothing in there about deprescribing, it's all about starting insulin. I wonder when they do these courses, if they tell GPs that it's actually not a great outcome to be putting exogenous insulin into type 2 diabetics. It actually doesn't let them live longer. It actually increases mortality and increases cardiovascular adverse events. So it's not great. And the more insulin we put people on, the more insulin resistant they become. So you end up on this terrible thing where people are on more and more insulin, just trying to get that sugar down. And that insulin isn't good. It's making them put on weight. It's driving metabolic disease. And it actually increases that SGLT2 receptor that we all love, the drug that does the opposite of that. So insulin's sort of the opposite of an SGLT2 inhibitor. And it increases sodium reabsorption, puts people's blood pressure up. I always say to people, let's just get you on the lowest dose of insulin that keeps the sugars under 10. So how do you stop insulin? How do you deprescribe it? Gosh, we need more funding. The government needs to give us some more research money. It's very hard. You need a PhD. Gosh, what are we going to do to stop the insulin? Well, you could have an omelette for breakfast. That's how you stop it. And it's not a joke because it's so easy. So you can have a Weet-Bix and a bit of insulin, or you can have an omelette and no insulin. And I have actually had a guy recently who it was as simple as that, and he said, why was I ever on insulin if it was just about like what I was eating? And honestly, I don't know. So if you're a GP and you're not sort of into low carb, just before you initiate and intensify the insulin, why don't you just scan the food? If there's a glass of orange juice in there, if they're having 3 bits of toast, cut it back to 1. Have half the amount of rice. You don't need to be keto. Just screen for those carbs in their food, because most people think they need to lose weight. But if you just tell them, no, just scan for the glucose. So that's easy. You don't even have to be a low carb GP. So, myself, I always put people on a very low carbohydrate diet. So if they're on insulin, I find you can get people off quite a lot of insulin quite quickly if you put them on a very low carbohydrate diet, which is, I target less than 30 grams total carbs. If you're a GP and you're just starting out and you don't know what to do, when I started, I found this fantastic article by Mark Cucuzella and Adele Height in Diabetes Management, and at the back of it is the Clinician's Guide to Low Carb Diets, and I printed that out. Honestly, that's all you need. It's so simple and fantastic. So how to safely reduce insulin? So this is what I do. So firstly, I ask the patient, how well controlled are you? What are your blood sugars? What's your HbA1c? If they're really well controlled, then you're going to be very worried about a hypo, and if they're badly controlled, then you can be less anxious. Now, with the short-acting insulins, I usually just stop it because I'm putting them on a ketogenic diet. They're not eating carbs with their meals, so they don't need the Nova Rapids. They don't need that rapid acting, so I just stop it. With the long-acting insulins, there's once daily basal insulin, I usually just halve it. So they're easy, those people that are on a rapid-acting and a long-acting, it's quick and easy. If they're on a mixed insulin, so like Ryzodeg insulin, it's a bit trickier because that's combining the rapid and that long-acting insulin. And if they're poorly controlled, I usually just halve that. But if they're well controlled, then I would always switch them to that once daily long-acting insulin. And you just have to be careful with those mixed ones. It's a different sort of story. I watch them really carefully. It's not, you have to be very careful. So I get them to measure their blood sugars before a meal and 2 hours after. That gives them feedback, okay? If the sugars go up a heap after the meal, then there's a lot of glucose in there. And also it gives me a guide as to what their sugars are doing. And we aim for blood glucose below 10. And if the next day the levels are below 10, then you can drop the insulin down again. And I make sure I stay in contact with them every day. So let's go through some cases showing those different sorts of insulins. So this is a guy who came to see me this year, and he's just easy. He's just on that once daily long-acting insulin. He's on 20 units a day. He's 65. He's pretty well controlled. His blood sugar ranges from 3 to 14 after porridge for breakfast in the morning. And then he has a hypo in the afternoon. So I looked at that and said, why don't we just stop the insulin? We'll get rid of the porridge. And so that was him done. Very easy. This is a sort of different case, still the long-acting, but a much bigger dose, 140 units. He's a 55-year-old guy. He's been on insulin for 10 years, you know, the dose increasing. HbA1c, 6.8%, blood sugars 5 to 8, pretty good. So I said, well, let's halve the dose and see how you go. So I rang him the next afternoon. I said, how are you going? And he said, oh, really well, sugars were good. And I said, all right, well, let's halve the dose again. And he went, look, I've gone on holidays and I've left my insulin at home. And I went, all right, well, let's see how you go without it. And he was fine. And that was 2 years ago. 2 years ago. So that didn't take long, and that was 140 units. So that's just showing you don't know. And I just wanted to show his triglycerides, which were 5.4 on a medication, and now, you know, they're 1.1 on low carb and no insulin.